All right, you guys, introducing Douglas Macgregor, former full bird colonel in the U.S. Army, and he's a regular writer for the American Conservative magazine. His latest is called Is There a Path to Peace in Ukraine? Welcome to the show. How you doing, Doug?
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Very great to have you on the show here. I have so many questions for you. I want to start with this article by the late, great Mark Perry. He had written this article for Politico magazine back in November 2015 called Inside the Pentagon's Fight Over Russia. And it's essentially, the narrative here is pitting you versus McMaster. And I guess I meant to say this in the intro. As many people know, but everyone should know, you were the commander during the Great Tank Battle of Iraq War I, when McMaster worked for you. And the way Perry tells the story here, you guys are kind of rivals and this kind of thing. He ended up becoming a general and all of that. But how in this story, you guys had somewhat different takes on how America would fight a conventional war against Russia, I think in this case, in the Baltics, but more generally in Eastern Europe. And so without getting too far into the details of just the difference of opinion about how to do that, I thought it was important to show that that's your role in this world. This is how you spent your life, is designing war plans for how the USA might best defeat even its most dangerous enemies on their territory. And I know a lot of people have been upset with you about some things you said on Fox News lately, make it sound like somehow you have sympathy for the devil here. And I just thought it was important that we're talking here to a man who designed a plan, if not the plan, for how to fight Russia if it ever really came down to it. And that seems important to me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, Scott, you're right that from a purely professional standpoint, I've always been focused on how best to execute potential missions in the future. That's not to say that I was an advocate for going to war with Russia. I'm not. But I listened to people talk about what they thought might happen if we did go to war, and I became very concerned. Because I didn't think then, and I don't think now, that we're really organized, trained, equipped in any way to march into Russia and fight the Russians. Just a silly notion. And at best, we might be able to defend for a short period of time, but even then, we're at great risk. So I took umbrage with the Army and its thinking about how it would fight, because frankly, the Army's thinking hasn't changed very much since World War II. And that's no way to go to war in the 21st century. So that's really the background on that particular article. If it's all right with you, I'd like to go back to the one that I wrote about the path to peace in Ukraine, simply because it received almost no attention whatsoever inside Washington or anywhere else. It was subjected to a media blackout. It's as though everyone in Washington desperately wants a conflict with Russia, which again makes no sense.
Well, so yeah, now, and really the reason I brought this up is just to essentially establish your credentials. You're not just some Army colonel. You're the guy who works on the plans for how to do this if we ever absolutely had to. And then you come up with a plan for peace, and that was on my list. I was going to save it toward the end here, but let's talk a little bit about, well, first of all, go ahead and describe your peace plan here and what's at stake, but then go ahead about the blackout and elaborate if you want. Do you really think that the consensus in D.C. is to drag this war out?
Yes, I do. It's misguided, it's dangerous, and it's self-defeating. But no, I think most of the Washington ruling class that lives in the bubble that we call the Beltway is very committed to prolonging this tragedy in Eastern Europe. They're not interested in any resolution that does not include significant damage to Russia. And ultimately, as President Biden inadvertently blurted out, the removal of Putin from office. It's ridiculous. The reason I wrote The Path to Peace is that there is one. If we're willing to step back and use what power we have not to harm anyone, but to create the conditions conducive to a settlement. And this is what great powers did for centuries to try and avoid destructive wars. And thus far, we haven't done it. And we can do it. And what I was hoping is that President Biden would break with the past and step forward and say, look, this is a disastrous war. And we know it's disastrous. It's already affecting the global economy, the global food supply, the global energy supply. Our European allies are gradually beginning to realize that they're being led down the path to destruction into a war they don't want to fight against a country that is not really their enemy. They may not like the Russians. They may have different views of Russia, but Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is not armed to the teeth and ready to march west at a moment's notice. There is no theater offensive capability in Russia today, which existed up until the late 1980s. So I was trying to get people to say, first of all, let's stop the fighting. Let's get a ceasefire in place. Then we can negotiate these issues. And the start point should be neutrality for Ukraine. There's no particular reason why Ukraine needs to be part of NATO. And I tried to alert people that when Eisenhower was president, he was very responsive to Austria's interest in neutrality. And he eventually said we should try to neutralize more states. So when Austria successfully negotiated the Austrian State Treaty with Moscow in 1955, President Eisenhower saw that as a potential model for other states because he understood that we don't have the resources, standing military resources or economic resources, to effectively defend 30 plus countries in Europe. We couldn't easily defend most of Europe back in 1955 against a Soviet Russia at that point, which was armed to the nth degree and had millions of troops at its disposal. Today, Russia is not what it was. It's not this overwhelming military capability by any stretch of the imagination, but on its own turf, operating from its own borders, it's a very formidable adversary. Mm-hmm. And Russia is not anxious to escalate to the nuclear level. But if Russia thinks we are escalating, yes, the Russians will turn to their own nuclear deterrent for security. Mm. We just need, first and foremost, to accept neutrality, no membership in NATO, and then let's look realistically at the territorial issues on the ground, because we haven't done that. We as usual, dismiss whatever the other side says as wrong or immoral or evil or something else, and then we depict the side that we happen to be supporting as saintly and perfect. None of that's accurate.
Mm. Well, you had me at H-bombs there. So, and this goes back this goes back to our original topic here, how to fight a conventional war against Russia. There's really no such thing as that, right? I mean, I guess my understanding has been...
Well, remember that the piece that you referred to was not about invading Russia. It was about defending Lithuania, Poland, right. Latvia.
But even then, right?
Potential Russian incursion.
Yeah,
no, I don't think so. Because first of all, we got to understand something. Putin has said this on numerous occasions. In fact, 4 years ago, he was accosted by some journalist while he was at a conference. I think it was in St. Petersburg, and all the Baltic states were represented. And somebody said, well, you've threatened to use a nuclear weapon against the Baltic states. He said, no, I haven't. He said, what do you think we are, crazy? We would use a nuclear weapon in the Baltic states immediately adjacent to our own borders? That makes no sense at all. What most people don't understand is that if you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or a nuclear weapon in Poland or a nuclear weapon in Lithuania, and you understand the fallout patterns, virtually all of that radiation, all of that fallout blows east across Russia, into Mongolia, Korea, northern China, and Japan. So the notion that anybody would use a nuclear weapon there is just ludicrous nonsense, least of all the Russians.
I guess what I was worried about would be that if we had a conventional war, like say, for example, Putin got angry and decided he was going to go protect the ethnic Russians of Lithuania, and America said, okay, Article 5, NATO is in effect. We're going to go put a land army on Macgregor's plan into Lithuania to keep the Russians out, that would just lead to general nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Forget Lithuania. They'd just be caught in the middle, but we'd be at full naval and air and nuclear war with Russia, and it would just devolve into the end of the world, because that's how all American wars with Russia would eventually go. No,
not at all. I think, again, I see no evidence that Mr. Putin wants to attack the Baltic states or anything in the West. I see a lot of evidence that he wants to do business with us. But having said that, if for some reason there was an incursion there, now I think it could be contained at the conventional level. The problem that I had, and I was trying to make this point, and it's one of the reasons that Mark Perry picked it up, was that I said we can't win it right now because we're not organized effectively. Our allies are not organized effectively. We're not effectively equipped. We don't have the command and control. And so you face the ugly prospect of being defeated and withdrawing, in other words, retreating. And suddenly you discover that the Atlantic Ocean is filled with Russian submarines. There is no escape and there is no reinforcement. In other words, you can't afford to lose the battle in Eastern Europe. There will be no Dunkirk. The war will not continue. You'll end up with a giant POW camp containing all of your troops, which is the last thing that we want. And that was my warning to people about the U.S. Army, that the U.S. Army was so anachronistic and so antiquated in its thinking and behavior, along with most of the European forces, that if we got into a knockdown, drag-out conventional war, we faced that potential disaster.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, some people would say, would we use a nuclear weapon? I don't think so. I don't think people in Washington are completely insane. I know that President Trump, under no circumstances, would have used a nuclear weapon. I can't conceive of any, except in the event that we were attacked with a nuclear weapon. Then yes, but otherwise he would never initiate something like that. And this is my concern with Biden right now, who was just in Warsaw, and you heard his speech. And then after he makes his speech about regime change, he also makes it clear that he has no intention of adopting no first use. In fact, he's now changing the nuclear policy to say that we'll use nuclear weapons in response to conventional attack, chemical attack, biological attack, any number of different circumstances, which I think is, very ill-advised, because that sends a message to the Russians. Well, if we think they're going to use a nuclear weapon, we might as well use our entire arsenal. So I would say that now, Scott, your previous assertion that a collision with Russia would lead almost inevitably to a nuclear exchange is now accurate. Yes. And I think it's accurate because of Biden and the stupid remarks he's made, not because it was inevitable in any case. That's where we need to step back. We need to move forward to a no first use. Make it abundantly clear. No use of nuclear weapons, period, unless one side uses it against us and our homeland. Otherwise, forget it. People don't understand there are nuances and differences in these things. And when you make the kinds of statements that Biden has made on the use of nuclear weapons, on regime change and so forth, sends a very dangerous signal to your potential opponent, in this case, Moscow.